good afternoon, or good evening. I would like to welcome everyone to this report launch of the contribution of higher education institutions to sustainable cities and communities. This is a joint event of UNESCO International Institute for Higher Education and the Times Higher Education, because we've developed this report together and we'll be sharing some of the insights, some of the cases, some of the data, and some of the recommendations with you today. In the last few minutes, we are going to first give the word to Francesc Pedró, the Director of the UNESCO IESALC, just to give some introductory remarks. Then we'll be seeing some data analysis from presented by Times Higher Education. We'll review some institutional practices. We'll see some government policies that how can they support universities to reach these objectives. We're going to review 4 case studies, and then we'll open the floor for some Q&A, just wrapping up right at the end of this. With this, I would like to give the floor to Francesc Pedró just for some introductory remarks about this topic.
We are halfway already to the 2030 agenda, and there is still a lot to do if we are to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Today, more than 80% of the global GDP is generated in cities, and by 2050, almost 70% of the world population is expected to live in cities for good or bad. The rise in urban population will increase the demand for resources, as well as services and infrastructure. The higher pressure on resources will also have an environmental and social impact, underpinning the vital role cities play in the pursuit of sustainable development. Now, against this context, the SDG 11, making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable, addresses these challenges. Government, organizations, and civil society have a responsibility to action, localizing and adapting the SDGs to every place and every sector. At the UNESCO International Institute for Higher Education, we are particularly interested in what higher education institutions can do, because we are convinced that they should play a key role in tackling these issues. Higher education institutions sometimes want to contribute to global challenges, but this shouldn't make them lose sight of local challenges, because these are the ones where they can provide a unique added value: their knowledge of their environment, their proximity, and their connection with other stakeholders. And this responsibility of higher education institutions is not restricted to larger, wealthier, or highly recognized institutions, and particularly universities, since each of them has a unique understanding of their respective local environment, issues, and stakeholders. Higher education institutions can make their contribution to their cities and communities through their 3 classical missions, and also through their management and operations. This can be a very direct and immediate impact, which can be multiplied if collaborating with other local actors, including governments, business, NGOs, and citizens. Again, this report is not just about what universities can do or what governments can do individually in an isolated way, like in silos, but also about what they can achieve by working together and how they can enable or support each other's actions towards, in this case, SDG 11. That is why in this report you will find actionable recommendations for both governments and higher education institutions, supported by numerous good practice examples from all over the world, from South Africa to the Philippines, from Egypt to Belgium, from Lebanon to Costa Rica, from Brazil to Ethiopia, from New Zealand to India. I invite you, therefore, to read the report and stay tuned to our work on the contribution of higher education to sustainable development. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Francesc. With those introductory remarks, I would like to give the word to our colleague, Ishan Cader from Times Higher Education, Director of Consultancy, and he's going to be presenting a few insights about the data analysis. Go ahead, Ishan, and welcome. You're muted. We still cannot hear you.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry about that. And it's a great privilege to be presenting our analysis here today for the SDG 11 report. By way of a quick introduction, I just wanted to give you some context about what Times Higher Education do in terms of assessing the higher education sector's contributions to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. In 2019, Times Higher Education launched its first annual assessment of universities' performance against all 17 United Nations development goals. We worked intensively with the sector, including advisory boards in all geographies, to understand in which ways universities are most effectively contributing to those sustainable development goal targets, and in what domains and areas they are acting in the most. In order to do this, we put together a theory of change. What we do is assess universities across 4 different domains: research, teaching, stewardship, and outreach. We can think here of research as the general research of all academics, with closely linked topics to the interdisciplinary areas around SDGs. Teaching contributions is all about how universities are empowering and enabling the next generation of young people to understand and work effectively to reach the SDGs. We think of stewardship as the example that universities set in undertaking and enabling SDGs themselves. This, for example, could be things like having a green campus. And finally, and one of the most important things, is outreach. Outreach refers to where universities are actually doing things in their communities and in their cities in order to translate the research, teaching, and stewardship into impact within those communities. So there are 17 SDGs with 169 targets and 232 indicators. What we have done is convert that into 105 metrics or metric areas that we can assess universities against, and 220 individual measurements across the 17 SDGs. Now, these measurements are a collection of publicly available data, as well as evidence that's submitted directly to Times Higher Education, through which we make those assessments. For SDG 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, we have 3 indicator groups. We have 3 metrics for research, 7 metrics for arts and heritage, and 9 metrics to understand the sustainable practices that universities are engaged in. So in total, these 19 metrics are assessed for all universities that submit data to us for SDG 11, and through that, we develop a score. So just reflecting on the latest 2023 impact submissions, overall, there were 1,625 institutions worldwide that submitted data for the SDGs. Now, across all the different SDGs, as you can see on that chart, SDG 17, Partnership for the Goals, is the one SDG that we require all universities to submit data for in a compulsory way. Once they submit SDG 17, they are eligible to submit up to a minimum of 3 other SDGs. You can see there that SDG 11 has 860 institutions that submitted last year. It was the 9th most popular SDG. Universities from 89 different countries submitted for SDG 11, of which 28 of those countries had 10 or more institutions submitting data. Now, there are a number of SDGs there that have lower rates of submission, but it is in Times Higher Education's capacity to try and increase those submissions on a year-by-year basis, which they have happened since 2019. We hope again in 2024, there'll be even more institutions submitting data for SDG 11. Now, when we look at the country-based overall performance of SDG 11, what we can see there is that Australia has the highest average score for SDG 11 with 18 participating universities. Now, I should say here that we have done this table so that it's a minimum of 10 participating universities that qualifies for this table. We do have some countries like Hong Kong and Denmark, which have got higher scores, but they have a much lower number of participating universities. So we felt that 10 was a fair representation in order to qualify for this. So we see Australia, Canada, United Kingdom, United States, and Spain leading the way in terms of the average score. Japan has the highest number of participant universities with 58. But what's really interesting here in this top 20 is that there are a number of countries from the global south appearing, including India, Philippines, Turkey, Indonesia, Egypt, and arguably Mexico, Thailand, and Malaysia as well. Now, I understand that the global south is sometimes a contentious term, but why I've referred to it here is really thinking about countries which have traditionally been maybe either disadvantaged or not really a part of the power structures of the global higher education system. What we can see here is that for SDG 11, the leading countries are generally global north universities. And that's a slightly different picture from some of the other SDGs. Just as an example, in SDG 7, the top 10 countries are all from the global south. So whilst it's good news that we do see greater participation and some good scores from the global south, this is another area that Times Higher Education can be supporting the global university sector in terms of their submissions. And if we aggregate this in terms of a regional performance, I have used here UNESCO's formal SDG regions. What we see on the top right-hand corner, right at the top at 80% there, is Oceania's performance. It's by some distance the highest performing region with an average score of almost 80. And that's over 20% more than the next highest performing region, which is Europe and North America. What we also see there is that the Latin American and the Caribbean region has the largest amount of variation in institutional performance. So again, what we feel is that this data can be used effectively to drive policy and to drive strategy change at universities across these regions in order to improve their overall SDG 11 indicators. As I mentioned, we have 3 different categories of analysing the SDG 11 data. The first one I want to go through is what we call sustainable practices. As you can see there, there are 9 different metrics that we have, all of which are provided by evidence submitted by the university into their policies or strategies across the following 9 areas. Sustainable practice targets, promoting sustainable community, allowing remote working, providing affordable housing for employees, affordable housing for students, having pedestrian priorities on campus, local authority collaborations regarding planning and development, planning development new building standards, and building on brownfield sites. Now, really here, what we would say is that these metrics fall between the stewardship and outreach pillars. Just some highlights here. Again, Oceania really leading the way with an average score of nearly 80, and East and Southeast Asian region second placed with just over 55. So a fairly significant difference there in terms of the average scores for sustainable practices. If we look at a metric level, we see that the best performing metrics here for universities around the world are policies of promoting sustainable commuting and providing affordable housing for students. Contrary to that, The weakest performing metrics are providing affordable housing for employees, as well as two of the outreach standards about working in the community with the local authorities and building on brownfield sites as well. Now, what this tells us is that there's a significant gap where universities are having fairly well-developed policies for providing affordable housing for students, but not really having the same for their staff. And I think this is a real area of improvement. And just to think about some individual region highlights there, although affordable housing for employees is one of the weakest performing metrics here, what we do see is a fairly high performance for the East and Southeast Asian regions in terms of their policies towards staff. And whilst local authority collaboration on building and redevelopment is fairly low globally, Oceania does have a really good performance with 64, and also a very high score for planning development new build standards with a score of 92. Moving on to arts and heritage practices. For this particular subsection, we have 6 main metrics. We also have an additional metric, which is about the proportion of expenditure that a university spends on supporting arts and heritage. And again, just looking at some highlights here, Oceania once again clearly leading the way with Europe and North America, East and Southeast Asia, and Latin America and the Caribbean all scoring an average of over 60 as well. In terms of the metrics, globally, we see that policies around public access to libraries is by far and away the most well-developed, whereas public access to green spaces is the least developed. As you can see from these metrics, in terms of the averages for each pillar, there is less variation than the previous slide for sustainable practices. So broadly speaking, when universities are dedicated to the arts, they are covering these areas such as public access, as well as the arts and heritage contributions. We do see some variation in the proportion of expenditure spent on supporting arts and heritage. Interestingly there, although Central and South Asia is towards the lower end of the average score for arts and heritage, it does have a relatively higher proportion of expenditure on supporting arts and heritage. And again, I think what we want to see there is greater evidencing of how that expenditure on supporting arts and heritage is translating into policy, strategy, and impact within the arts and heritage areas. And the final area in terms of assessing SDG 11 is around research metrics. Now, these scores are taken from data which is published by Elsevier, who have got specific SDG relevant data for sustainable cities and communities. The first column, Sustainable Cities and Communities Site Score, refers to the number of academic publications which are in the top 10% of global journals for this particular area. The second column refers to field-weighted citation impact, and the final column refers to the overall volume or scale of publications. And of course, this is all relative to the regional size and is normalized for that. So again, some highlights here. We see Oceania leading the way quite significantly, around the average score of 25% more than Europe and North America. We see in terms of overall scale, normalized per population for these regions, again, Oceania doing very well, nearly 90% there. And we see much more work that needs to be done in terms of overall publications per population in terms of Central and South Asia and North Africa and Western Asia. In terms of site score, which is essentially academics getting their publications and research into the top 10 journals, again, we see Oceania quite way ahead and a significant drop-off thereafter. I think all regions there, apart from Oceania, need to work to ensure that their SDG 11 based research has more visibility within that top 10% of journals. And then finally, with field-weighted citation impact, on average, this had the highest score across the 3 research metrics. And interestingly, although Central and South Asia have the lowest overall score, universities there perform particularly well in field-weighted citation impact, as opposed to their volume or scale of research and getting their publications in the top 10 journals. What this tells us is that where Central and South Asian academics are publishing on SDG 11, they tend to have a more than average citation impact. And this is a really good story for them. What universities in these regions really need is greater enablement and empowerment and potentially funding to enhance their publication output, and greater visibility through partnerships, through conferences, and through dialogue and sharing of research practice to ensure that they're getting those top 10% of journals. I just wanted to reflect now on how scores are calculated. So for evidence-based submissions, institutions are scored according to whether the evidence is generic or specific. And when we say specific, we mean that it is publicly available evidence of a policy or strategy making impact with evidence of that impact as well. If you cannot show evidence of that impact, it's just a policy or a strategy, so we would constitute that as generic evidence. So universities will still get a score for having a generic submission, but you get a higher score if there are specific submissions. The example I can show on this screen is the submissions by region for the metric on policies that promote sustainable commuting. This was the highest scoring average for all the metrics within the sustainable practices pillar. As you can see here again, Oceania really leading the way, and a lot of universities from Central and South Asia that did submit data for this SDG actually didn't submit data for this particular metric. And this is a recurring story with universities around the world where they submit data, but with no evidence to show of a particular policy or strategy or having evidence of impact. I want to make the point here that it may be the case that these universities are actually doing fantastic work in the communities that they serve. But the key thing here is to ensure that universities can evidence that impact. And I think that's one of the driving forces of our project, is to ensure that universities are transparent and that they're able to share the work that they do, because it's only through that sharing of work that that impact will be recognized in terms of reaching the SDGs. I also wanted to do a very quick spotlight on Oceania. It's been recurring throughout this presentation so far that Oceania has led the way in terms of its performance in SDG 11. Now, apart from the metric on affordable housing for employees, all the metrics submitted by universities in Oceania had over 50% either generic or specific evidence submitted. Sustainable commuting and remote working practices had the highest number of highly evidenced specific submissions, and other highlights included the affordable housing for students and sustainable new building standards. So at the moment, universities in Oceania really are the beacon for strong practices on sustainability related to SDG 11. And one of the things that I believe should come out of this research is a greater sharing of those practices and partnership creation between these universities and universities in other regions that are not performing so well in SDG 11. Thank you so much for your time. I will now pass back to Victoria.
Thanks very much for the presentation into the data analysis, Ishan. And now I'm presenting myself, Dr. Victoria Galán Muros. I'm the Chief of Research and Analysis at the UNESCO International Institute for Higher Education. And I will be presenting you some institutional practices. These are university higher education institution practices for SDG 11. Here we'll be presenting some practices in general, as we have plenty of specific examples within our report, but we just don't have the time to cover these specific examples now. So we will be just speaking about those practices that we've seen more commonly. So starting with the fact that we believe that the potential of universities for SDGs is really large. And this is not only for SDG 11, it's for all the SDGs in general. And we do believe that universities can contribute to SDGs from teaching, learning, research, engagement, and also the management of the university. If we go now specifically to SDG 11. SDG 11 is an interesting goal, because if geographically is very clear, then topic-wise is connected to many other. It includes economic, it includes environmental, and it includes social aspects. If we go to the teaching and learning, we will see that lots of universities are offering more courses considering the local needs related to SDG 11. In this case, it could be like doing more capstone projects to be applied locally, doing more urban planning studies, but also sustainable urban planning, sustainable architecture, masters in smart cities, or urban solid waste management. We've been seeing all these studies that has been gradually increasing in many universities all over the world. But also the curricula of each of those courses also is more and more addressing social issues. This means, for example, bringing guest lecturers to local guest lecturer to your classroom, or presenting local case studies. This could also be about applying project-based or problem-based methodologies in your classroom related to local issues. However, we cannot expect teachers to be able to do that without some training. So that's why training teachers for local impact is also something that some universities have started to do, and it's critical. We really want to have an impact through the teaching and learning in the local environment. We go to the second mission, we go to research. Here it's also whether this is a decision of the university managers or the researchers themselves. There is also an increasing number of universities who is addressing urban challenges in their research. We see universities in the Middle East increasing the research on water management, for example, in a context of scarcity. We see universities in Venice researching on the impact of mass tourism in their city, or universities in the US-Mexican border doing research on immigration. So all this is also a different approach than to integrate a local perspective into research. So they both complement each other, and universities are increasingly being aware of that. There's also the possibility, in some cases, for universities to participate in geographies of innovation. This is about partnering with other entities in order to do research in collaboration. And these are local entities, and as much as we all work online and are more and more comfortable in a remote environment, place still matters. And it matters for research because it not only creates the physical connection that is needed for some research and some labs and infrastructure, but also the personal one that has proven to be really, really important. In terms of the third mission and the engagement, universities are partnering more with local government for urban planning. And this goes in both directions. Universities want to be present at the table, but also local governments are realizing that universities are a source of knowledge that they can tap into for their urban planning issues challenges. And this is happening more and more, as I said, whether this comes from universities or the government initiative, but also universities are partnering with social and environmental entities for student volunteering programs. If we think about how direct the impact of university can be in the local community, this is a student volunteering right in the door step. Universities as well offer, or can offer, or some of them offer, a very large cultural agenda. In some smaller cities, universities are the ones that are really driving this, whether this is through museums, through libraries, through expositions, concerts. Universities are really a very important player in the cultural agenda in some cities around the world. You see some example in the report as well. And if we think about the university as an institution, sometimes universities are excellent, are telling other stakeholders what they should do, but they are not always the best in being the example for others. However, universities are also taking a very proactive role and are trying to make sure that they offer sustainable commuting options for their students and their staff, whether these are biking or these are, some universities have their own buses, for example. And if commuting and transport is important, housing, it's a key factor as well for universities, in the sense that if students, mostly students, also staff, but if we focus on students, do not have affordable housing, and this is very difficult in some large cities of the world, let's think about New York, Paris, Hong Kong. If they don't have affordable housing, this could be the very first big barrier for their accessibility to higher education. So whether this is universities that are providing their own housing, or whether these are universities encouraging the private sector to also offer affordable housing, universities really have an important role to play there. Another aspect for the administration and management of the universities is whether they share the open spaces and the infrastructure with their communities, whether this is how much of the campus is actually open and the library is open for the communities to be able to see, to go and use them, how much of the infrastructure, because labs might not be open to the public, but they might be open to be rented to businesses and local businesses and SMEs, and in that way they can also contribute to local entrepreneurship and innovation. So these are just some of the examples. You see more in the report on how universities and institutional practices can contribute to local communities and cities. If we do that focus on the geographies of innovation that I've commented on before, I think it's worth highlighting because they've been popping up in different parts of the world, and whether these are called science park, technology park, innovation hubs, innovation districts, it is about enhancing the impacts of higher education institutions through collaboration, mostly in research, but it can also, and it does also happen in teaching in their local communities. We're talking about that no matter what the name that they have, we're talking about that these are spaces that are clusters, so they are geographically close, in which a set of innovative organizations, but also intermediaries, gather together to collaborate in innovation activities. This can be research or also teaching, but they're also actively managed. Sometimes we believe that just by having a set of buildings, then something is going to happen. Innovation and collaboration will happen. Geographies of innovation are very much about people. So that's why it's important that proximity, because that also creates the personal relationships that then create the successful collaboration. We go to government policies. This is the first statement, is that this is not just about universities. Governments, local governments, and also governments at other levels have a critical role to play in how universities can contribute to their urban development and growth. So, as mentioned before, more and more governments are considering universities in order to be part of those stakeholders that can make decisions or can advise in urban planning issues. We start by looking at how the campus, the university campus, is integrated in the city. Some of them are right in the city center, some of them are further away, but also, apart from location, is how they are connected. How many urban barriers are to get to the campus and how many transportation options. And yes, the university can partly play a role on that, but that is related very much with the decision of the local government. Also, when we are talking about a university that is created or a university that is expanded, we need to consider, and governments need to consider, the effects on the local community, the public infrastructure, and also the different services. Also, something and an interesting trend that has been happening in the last 10 years or so is that universities not only has built more sustainably, but has also partnered with government to be located or relocated or expanded into brownfields or public abandoned building, or the underused real estate have been repurposed for new campuses. There are really nice examples of universities in like old factories and old train stations and all. So they are really not just not creating unnecessary new infrastructure, but also reusing the ones that were already there in a sustainable way. And if we talk about housing, again, yes, universities might be able to offer their own housing, but at the end of the day, the housing policy of the local government is critical. There are some governments that really take a very proactive role because they believe that a student having affordable accommodation within their cities is essential. So they, as governments, subsidized a student accommodation. Some of them, they are for all the students. Some of them only choose low-income students or students for rural areas. And also the housing policies can, and in some cities in which 50% of the population or 30% of the population is students, they are controlling and monitoring the pressure that a student accommodation has on the local housing markets. In the report, you'll be able to find how different cities and how different local governments have adjusted these policies just to make sure that a student can find enough affordable accommodation within their cities. Also, within transportation, governments, the local governments have very much of a say. Is there affordable and frequent public transport in the city? That is as a starting point. Or do students need a car, for example, to arrive to university? Some local governments actually also subsidize public transport for students. In some cities, it's actually free for them or is heavily subsidized. And we are also talking about pedestrian paths and cycling lanes in the whole city, but specifically for the campus, not just within the campus, but also whether the campus is connected to the rest of the city. For that, if we think about students and how much do they vouch for these and how much do they use this transportation, they're actually very important, a critical mass for further investment in local cycling infrastructure. If it's used by them, it will be vouched by them, and the investment will continue in the future. And the last ones, we're talking about that, yes, governments support universities in different ways for just their normal functioning and running. However, there is a possibility of reaching additional funding agreements and really having governments, if they see that universities can be a good partner for the local development, then they can reach additional funding agreements. For example, there are governments that are funding university hospitals to attend the local community. There are governments that are also funding legal clinics, so universities can give free legal supports to either to everyone in some cases or to people of low resources. At the end of the day, it is about universities and government, and maybe also other stakeholders, just coming together and say, how can we both partner in order to be able to increase the impact in our cities and communities. As I said, many examples that you can find within the report. This is just a general review of the main practices that both universities and governments could do. And with this, I'll give the word to my colleague, Jaime Roser. He will be speaking about 4 good practice case studies more in detail from different world regions that we've included in this report. Jaime, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Victoria. So for the good practice cases that I'm going to share, I would like to give you a global view. Of course, in the report, which we invite you to read, you'll find tens and tens of concrete examples, but here you can see how all of these different good practices, they coalesce into a single university, and how a single university can have a global vision of the contribution to SDG 11 from all the different sections that both Ishan and Victoria have been addressing. So I'll start with the Aswan University in Egypt. This university represents 10% of the entire population of the city of Aswan, so it has a considerable impact on all of its services and infrastructure, as you can imagine. And because of this, it's so important, they have made strong commitments to make sustainable commuting for all their students and staff. And it's important that these commitments have a deadline and that they are public for better accountability. They also have, of course, their student accommodation. But I wanted to highlight that in one of the most recent urban developments, it's an expansion of the city of Aswan, they have already from the beginning and in partnership with the government designed a new campus so that this new expansion of the city already incorporates the higher education element within its planning. They also have a lot of different activities related to culture. And of course, you may all be familiar with the monumental archaeological remains in Aswan, but something that is not so known is the intangible heritage, for which they have a specific unit that goes out there and documents handcraft, elements of popular culture, and make sure that they are preserved and then they stay alive and they get valorized. And the other thing I wanted to highlight for Aswan University is how they drive the local development in a sustainable way. They have created what they call some special units that have sort of internal management autonomy to some extent. And with this, they use them to provide consulting services to the government, to help the government, for example, with urban planning or with building sustainability. Or they help businesses, helping some photovoltaic panels manufacturers test their new products, certify their quality. And they have something called the Technology, Innovation and Commercialization Office, which helps entrepreneurs protect their intellectual property and also drive entrepreneurship in the students. So they have entrepreneurship club with trainings, with events, with competitions, with incubation of businesses. And all of these things together from the very beginning of entrepreneurship to support of consolidated businesses, giving them knowledge transfer and technology transfer, and finally working with the government can be a very important input for any region in the world. But for the university, what is also important is that it gives them additional revenue because of all of these services. they are not for free. They charge the businesses and the governments. And what they can do with this additional income is to fund all of their other sustainability initiatives, to fund sustainable investment, to fund scholarships and other equity measures in the university. So we can see how this can link very well some of the different policies that we've been commenting. The next case I wanted to mention is the National University in Taiwan, in Taipei. This university has their own sustainability office. They have their annual reporting has an SDG structure for measuring impact, which is interesting. Of course, they have some sustainable transportation and student accommodation. But something interesting also is that they've committed that all their buildings, present and future, will go through a specific green building label that exists in the island of Taiwan. And they also have specific services that integrate better the different communities of the island. And for example, the indigenous community of Taiwan, which is not very well known abroad, has their own resource centers to be better integrated into the university. Of course, they have their cultural events. The library, which is quite famous in the architecture world, is open for everyone, as so are their museums. And in terms of developing the local area, I wanted to highlight how they've been working with the government in different projects, and they seem to have a very close relationship with the local government. And also they've integrated the local population and like individual citizens in what is called participatory sensing. So they have some research for monitoring urban climate, and they engage volunteers from even outside the university, high school students, and so on, so that they not only help them do this research, but also engage them in the importance of climate in their city. So it combines the research and the dissemination in the same project. And of course, they incorporate all of these learnings into their pedagogy. The next university we have analyzed is the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. It's a university that, of course, like the others, they have their buses funded by the university, and they have their student accommodation, and they've been having a strong investment on efficient lighting, heating, solar panels, and everything to essentially reduce their carbon footprint, which is, of course, a global challenge, but they have managed to create a local impact in this sense. But an even more local impact is something they've been doing as a merge of their teaching and their engagement, which is a project they have, and they've been working with different initiatives with the community. This is just one example in which in an isolated village, they've been helping them get access to electricity, to water, and to help this infrastructure develop their local economy and give them access to other resources. So this is a good example in which the students get real life experience on very, very practical engineering problems that you can find in rural areas in Africa or in underdeveloped areas near the big cities. And through this learning, they help the communities around the university. They also have many examples of driving innovation in Johannesburg. I invite you to check the report for all of these details. But I think what is important to highlight is how they've addressed this throughout the whole life cycle of businesses, with the government, with the industry, and established some very solid long-term partnerships. And finally, the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. This one is quite large, and they have, besides the different things that the other universities also have, they have a strong emphasis on using their infrastructure for the cultural life of the community and, for example, the lifelong learning of all of its citizens. They have this open university fully early, so they have courses and so on. They have language courses available to everyone. They have a lot of school trips with the children of the nearby schools. I think that the picture says it all. And they have, and I cannot emphasize this enough, a lot of services for the community, from a university hospital to mental health care services, sport facilities, legal advice, like the examples Victoria was mentioning, entrepreneurship incubators, and so on. And what is important to keep in mind with this Sao Paulo case is that they not only provide it in a specific moment, but this is a structural part of the way they train their students. So the psychology department is the one in charge of these mental health care services. The legal department is the one gathering volunteering students to do the legal advice. And then the government is providing funding to keep the services running. So it shows very well how all the different parts come in together. And that would be the end of our presentation. I believe we have a little bit of time in case there is some questions from the audience. Let me stop sharing for a second. The first question is very easy. Yes, the presentation is going to be available. We'll upload it in YouTube tomorrow, probably. And I don't know if there's any other question. I see we have a question on the funding. Victoria mentioned it already, the importance of the governments in providing funding, not just for the general funding of the university, but like for specific services. I think some of the last case studies show, for example, in the University of Asuan, how besides everything else, the university can find their own niches of additional income through these services to the community, well, to businesses, to governments, which can help them fund their other, let's say, non-profitable investments, which can be based on infrastructure, can be based on equity measures. I don't see more questions, so we are right in time for the final wrap-up. So Victoria, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Jaime, for going in depth into those 4 cases. Indeed, I don't think we're making justice just presenting very quickly all the activities that they have and all the efforts that they put. So I really recommend people to go and see the cases and get inspired by all those different activities and those approaches that they're doing. Some final recommendations that we have in the report, we have like 12, which seems like a lot, but this is a broad topics. Other recommendations for policymakers, but also recommendation for higher education institutions. And each of them will be or are detailed within the report. We're just going to highlight as a wrap up, what are the main things, considering everything we've said until now, what are the main things that we believed both policymakers and higher education institutions should do to increase the impact of universities to SDG 11. So it's been clear that campuses are important and should be integrated, whether this is with the city or within the city. But it's not only about integration, they should also be accessible. They should be accessible either by food, cycling, and or affordable and sustainable public transport. This is essential, and it removes a very initial barrier to just get to campus in the first place. If we talk about university buildings and infrastructure, we would call for the highest environmental efficiency standard that they can afford. This is very important for the running of the university, but also for the impact in the city. When we talked about higher education institutions, we would like to encourage them to ensure student housing that is affordable access. This could be the very initial barrier for access to higher education, but also to support the cultural heritage. Some universities are actually located in a very important heritage within cities, but they also can promote arts and can promote culture, whether it is their own or the others in the community. Universities should also provide professional services to governments, NGOs, and businesses to improve city and communities. Take advantage that the other stakeholders are interested in this, and the university have the knowledge for that. More recommendation, we are talking about promoting project and or problem-based learning throughout the curricula related to the local environment, but also very important and very direct is to promote the volunteering of a student and staff, maybe by partnering with local NGOs or also local governments. We would love to see how universities increase their research related to SDG 11 topics, but also not necessarily do it alone, also leverage the opportunities to partner with the private sector to develop very specific innovative solutions that benefits their cities. And doing all this is great, but we've seen that a lot of universities do not actually monitor and evaluate these activities. And we believe that to do so and to check these targets regularly, it's essential in order to ensure the sustainability of those measures and the impact in the future. With all these and details can be found in the report, we show how different universities can do lots of activities, and don't get us wrong, we're not expecting universities to do each and every of these things. Sometimes it can feel a bit overwhelming, so we are only putting on the table all the options that are available. We know the universities have different capabilities, different budget possibilities, but the first thing is information. They need to be aware that all these things can be done and then prioritize based on their own strengths and their own strategies, which are the ones that they are going to make more emphasis on. Just as a very much a closed up, would like to highlight that last year, together with the Times Higher Education, we created 2 reports for SDG 5, gender equality, 2 different parts. They were presented and are available in both websites in English and Spanish. We are doing this one now about cities and communities. It is available in English in both websites. The Spanish version will come very soon. And we are working in SDG 8, which is economic growth and decent jobs. We also want to and are currently analyzing the role of the universities on this. Early 2024, we'll have a report on that. We hope that with this, we can contribute just a little bit to give some insights and to give some ideas and inspirations to universities around the world so they can make their communities and their cities better. I'd like to thank again to my colleagues Jaime and Ishan for their effort, their collaboration and their work and their passion put in this report. And I would like to thank everyone for being here with us today. You will receive the presentation, the report, and all the information related to these initiatives very, very soon. Thanks very much, and I hope to see everyone again soon.